Thank you so much for having me. The work I'm presenting today is sort of an imagining of where my research program would have gone if I had stayed and focused on that. Some family obligations took me away, but I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you all for your wonderful talks. And thank you so much to the organizers for putting this thing together. It's honestly an honor to be here. So I want to start my talk by recalling Anjan's sort of meta level tone from his talk, because my talk is definitely firmly at that sort of meta stance level. Unlike some others, though, I have no problem with voluntarism being too permissive. I think that's actually one of its great virtues. It acknowledges the fact that we live in a very diverse epistemic community, not just because we have different access to information, but often just because we have different values and we're going to come to different conclusions. A prior supervisor of mine actually thought, he would always say that solipsism is a rational position if you don't care about having a good life or people or anything like that. It's perfectly consistent to be a solipsist. Tend to agree more or less with that sort of attitude. That's logically consistent and pragmatically coherent for such a view, given certain values. And that's very much what the stance perspective, right, the voluntarist perspective that Van Frossen sort of started us on is all about. So I think a lot of the discussion on realism and anti-realism has really focused on the logically consistent aspects of the two criteria by which we judge a stance rationally permissible. If we include epistemological consistency in there, especially so. I wanted to focus exclusively on the issue of pragmatic awareness, right? Pragmatics of stance choice. And I'll motivate that as a procedure to talk. So I just want to sort of shelve talk about epistemic risk and focus on pragmatic risks in stance adoption. I do this because I myself am kind of a fence sitter in the realism debate, or like the skinwalker or shapeshifter, I don't know. I tend to sort of go both directions. Sometimes I find myself very earnestly arguing an anti-realist point in a conversation. Sometimes I find myself very earnestly arguing a realist point in a conversation. And often those are PM, not P, type positions. I don't think that makes me inconsistent. I think that means that I have different contexts in which I'm having those dialogues. And I think that those perspective switches are something that we all do whether we want. But I think that in certain circumstances, I'm not really sure which tradition I should take. And I think of the pragmatic approach that I sort of outlined in prior work as an effort to provide a guide that reflects circumstances. How do you make a choice between being a realist and an anti-realist when maybe there's nothing sort of epistemic on the line, or maybe you don't really want to focus on that, but you need some reason to be a realist or an anti-realist. I'm going to suggest that a focus on pragmatics can get us. One of the reasons I'm not too worried about voluntarism being too permissive is that I think it deals only with live options, prior live options. So Scientology, for instance, right, it's not a live option. I don't even want to consider it. But constructive empiricism and some form of semi-realism are both live options to me. I consider them. I find myself contemplating them in certain circumstances. So I think we need a way to make those decisions, and I hope to outline them for everybody today. So this is just a quick outline. I'm sorry the text is so small. I'm rushing to get my slides done. I should have put it in too. But basically, I want to talk a little bit just about what motivates action and treating belief or philosophical commitment as itself an action, a thing that we do. And then I want to go on to talk a little bit about that in the context of the realism debate, and then talk about the importance of finding common grounds for dialogue, right? That we have been spending, a lot of time in the realism debate just talking in circles, talking past each other, And I think it's really important for us to make sure that we acknowledge and find common ground. Then the bulk of the paper is this part here, where I'm going to go in and talk about a decision theoretical rendering of the formal structure of prudential or pragmatic reasons as a way of sort of getting a framework or what was called yesterday by Bobby, a meta language, something that we can all sort of agree on as a way of speaking about the trade-offs between taking a realist stance or an anti-realist stance. I'll go through a couple of relatively toy examples just for illustration. And then I'm going to talk about the ways that we can actually use our common grounds between realists and anti-realists, of the type that we're considering at least, which is empirical evidence as a validation for pragmatic arguments in favor of one position to the other. So very basically, let's start with this question of, why do we do anything at all? Certainly we have animal drives, or some sort of evolutionary explanation for that. But why don't we just Bartleby the Scrivener? Maybe that's too classic of an example. I would prefer not. Just lay in bed, do nothing all day, right? For lazy Smurf, for the millennials, think Snorlax doesn't do anything unless it's forced to. For my generation, it's right. Why don't we just smoke weed for the party? Well, I think the answer is quite obvious, right? It isn't some sort of deep point. Yes. Because we have motivations, we have values, we have aims, we have goals, we have projects, we have things that we want, we have things that we're seeking, that we're after. Those are the motivations, as I sort of generalize over. They're going to give us the impetus for adopting a stance or getting out of bed or doing anything at all. These are the things that account for equally rational agents taking different actions, right? You and I may be equally rational, but you take a different stance and if I take a different stance, we have the same body of evidence. Well, why? Because we have different motivations. We have different things that we're trying to do in some practical context. So I also just want to sort of get a very contentious, I probably think, sort of definition of philosophy, where philosophers are in the business of formulating, elaborating, and evaluating positions on various philosophical topics. So I'm going to cover everything. I know there's lots of philosophy debate tent, but for our purposes, let's just think of what we're doing when we do philosophy as that. And we do that because we're invested in some way. We have something that's motivating us to do that, whether it's interest or puzzlement or curiosity or what have you. They can often be purely intellectual motivations for doing, evaluating, accepting philosophical position. But I argue they can also be practical. You can have a good reason to be a realist or an anti-realist. This is a purely practical motivation. So, we cynically can say, well, we're interested in philosophical projects because we're professionally invested. We could also just say we got into it because we were intellectually invested. But I want to really focus in and explore on that practical question of, does it really make a difference what philosophy we accept? Chesterton once said, it's important for a landlady to know their lodger's income, but it's more important to know their philosophy. Right? You gotta know. Sometimes philosophies help us understand who each other are and who we are ourselves. I think that's a real practical kind of question. So, depending on the type of investment that we have, that's going to make an impact on how we resolve disputes amongst competing philosophies. If it's purely professional, we'll get sort of what I call the conference proceedings that are minuscule equivalents in epistemology or something like that, where we're just picking over things that don't really make too much of a difference. But if we're intellectually interested in it, right, and we really want to know what the right position is, sometimes what we do is we construct this ideal rational agent. You know, what Russell said, is there any knowledge so certain that no man can deny it, right? He's abstracting to this rational agent, asking, what would that rational agent, perfectly rational agent, believe? And then we should believe that. I think there's an open question of how we might resolve philosophical disputes practically. And I want to sort of present a sketch of a bit of a framework that will help us do that. So contexts in which our commitments to scientific realism might make a difference, right? Like a real practical difference to the way that we behave, the outcomes that we achieve. Scientific practice. If you look at the early realism debate, you know, between like Planck and Mach and even later Popper, a lot of them were really concerned about how people's philosophical attitudes would impact their scientific practice, right? Would they test their theories sufficiently if you're an anti-realist, or would you just add some ad hoc modification and be done with it, right? There we go. Now it's consistent with the data. I think there's a lot, but I think you can divide out scientific practice and start pointing at different types of scientific practice, different things we need to do to fill out the whole scientific project, and start asking about how philosophical worldviews impact people's practice in those contexts. And anybody who's read some of my prior work will notice that I dealt with a couple of those examples in at least one context. But I agree with Anjan and Park and a few others that it's also going to matter in science education, whether we present views in a realist perspective or if we present them in an anti-realist perspective. That could have a serious impact on the way that students uptake their understanding of science, the way they're able to deploy scientific methods in civil society. It's also going to have, you know, all these other contexts where your philosophy is probably going to have an impact on the way that you behave and the outcomes that you achieve. Whether you're a science writer, whether you're a policymaker who's trying to, you know, account for climate change, right? Or if you're a historian of science, and if anybody's read Theodore Arabatzis's what's it called, a biographical approach to the history of science, where he talks about, you know, the electron as a thing, as a real thing, which is very heterodox view in the history of science, right? To be a realist. He argues that there's actually benefits to it, practical benefits for the discipline of history of science to, in certain circumstances, be a realist. In other circumstances, be an anti-realist. So I just wanted to focus in on the idea of common ground. Common ground is this body of information or methods or anything else that's presumed to be shared by the parties in the discourse. And that's what we're looking for here in terms of finding a method to resolve this dispute between realists and anti-realists, or to continue the dialogue, to break that stalemate, if you believe in the stalemates. You know, there's some skeptics here about that. Clark just gives these synonyms. I thought they were helpful. You know, shared knowledge, conversational context, common set of presumptions, contextual domain, tacit assumptions, blah, 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 right? These are, this is sort of what we're searching for in order to have a renewed and robust conversation about whether to be a realist or an anti-realist. Because if we don't have common ground, we're just butting our heads against the wall, or we're just talking past each other. So in the debate between scientific realists and anti-realist empiricists, rationality, along with, you know, the theoretical and empirical results of science, have generally served as that common ground. Everybody, you know, we've said it several times in this workshop. Everyone's pro-science, right? Nobody's anti-science. Nobody's rejecting it out of hand or anything like that. So that's what's typically served as our common ground. as well as this very minimalist, bridled irrationality view of rationality that we get from Van Frossen. But arguing just on those grounds has, arguably stalled out this intractable stalemate. So I prescribe a focus on the shared aims, values, practice, etc., that people might have as additional common ground between realists and anti-realists moving forward in order to move forward. I think that by focusing in on our shared motivations, right, finding those as part of our common ground, what are we doing? What are we trying to achieve? That's going to allow us to actually have a very fruitful debate with our opponents, with ourselves, and provide maybe edifying information for fence sitters out there. I think it's interesting too that this idea of common ground largely comes from Rice, whose theory of meaning is fundamentally one about discourse. The meaning of a sentence is the idea I'm trying to put in your head, right? The Griceans are all about conversation as fundamental to meaning. And so I think that that's one thing that we have already acknowledged is that the empirical results of science are a common ground in this debate. But I think if we take that up a level, that means that evidence itself, right, empirical methods are common ground. Every party to this debate that's worth engaging with, as far as I'm concerned, takes evidence as the sort of origin of knowledge, right? Or at least somehow fundamental to knowledge. If you're departing from the evidence, you're disregarding it, you're not really a party that we want to be engaging with. So standard forms of scientific evidence, right, galvanometer, readouts, force measurements, etc., already serve as this common ground, staple of the debates between realist and anti-realist empiricists, as both sides are pro-science. But in the context of the human sciences, which presumably we're also pro about, right? The standard body of scientific evidence includes, the effects of religious and philosophical and other intellectual commitments in people's individual psychology on their habits, actions, and social structure. So I think if we're going to start looking at the way that philosophical outlooks impact people's habits and actions and the outcomes of their ability to achieve their goals, I think that's already included in the common ground. So there should be no principled issue on either side for expanding this common ground very explicitly to include evidence that adopting some philosophical position has a robust effect on certain habits, actions, and social structures, and potentially our ability to achieve certain motivations or fulfill certain motivations. So characterize that. So despite characteristic philosophical differences, including values, epistemic policies, involved in different stances, realists and anti-realists often have other aims and goals that they share in common, right? They want to, take care of their family. They want to educate people properly about science. They want to create scientifically competent citizens when they educate. Or you can imagine a science writer who's a realist, and you can imagine a science writer who's an anti-realist. They both largely have the same goal, right? Realists and anti-realists may likewise value, scientific progress, for instance. That's sort of the basis of that early Popper-Planck debate, right? We all want scientific progress. Should we be realists or should we be anti-realists in achieving it? So in the practical context of a working scientist, it would matter if those who adopt a realist attitude tend to be better scientists or tend to be worse scientists. And if we could somehow demonstrate that, right? If we could somehow come to an agreement that realists make better metrologists or anti-realists make better, studiers of new phenomena, right? Explorers of phenomena, then it would be prudent to adopt that kind of an outlook in that practice. And I think that would be rationally preferable, but by no means mandatory. I'm in no way trying to be what I call a fascist of epistemology, where like you have to be a realist in this context. No, what I want is to provide people with guidance, right? But ultimately, everybody's mind is their own to make up. So now we get into the meat of this, and really all I'm trying to do is provide a kind of practical context, or a kind of language, a framework in which we can have discussions about and debates over which position is going to best serve our practical ends. You know, assuming that we've identified our shared ends, and one person is saying, well, yeah, if you want to make scientific progress in this field, you should definitely be a realist. And the other saying, no, I disagree. How do we really hash that out? How do we get into the nitty gritty of that? And rather than just sort of banging our fists, actually have a robust and progressive dialogue. Well, let's first start by agreeing that if evidence X, Y, and Z suggests that performing phi in practical context Q will likely result in outcome A, and agent A is in context Q, right? So this is, I looked at history, I did some surveys, whatever else, suggests that being a realist in practical context of metrology will likely result in the outcome of good measurements. And agent A is in that context of being a metrologist, then A stands to benefit from maybe I messed that up. From adopting realism. Yeah, sorry, excuse that slug. Oh, yes, right. And A stands to benefit from it then. So a simple example, right? Historical evidence suggests that adopting scientific realism in the context of scientific practice is more likely to result in scientific progress. Agent A is a working scientist, and A aims to make scientific progress, right? This is the clause that is about the motivation of the individual under consideration, right? Because maybe A is a working scientist, but they're a saboteur, right? They think that scientific progress is going to result in Skynet and sending Terminators back or whatever, however it might be. People have different aims, right? Even in the same context as a working scientist, we can't assume that just because of their role, they actually share the aims as everybody else. So this is required. We need to actually include that. But if those three hold, then A has, I say, a prudential reason to be a realist. So things are much more complicated than that, obviously, right? That's very, very, very bare bones. Not just in the context of scientific realism, but in any effort to pragmatically evaluate beliefs and philosophical commitments based on their expected practical utility. So I use this phrase, expected practical utility, very purposely, because I'm looking to actually extend some of the work in decision theory in epistemology to apply it to a purely pragmatic evaluation of philosophical commitments or beliefs. Doing this properly is going to take a lot more time than I have here. I think I only have about 18 minutes left. But I think it's the natural progression of my approach. I think it's where I would have naturally been taking it. I think it's a potentially very beneficial way for the realism debate to proceed to uncover edifying information, right? Some sort of guidance for the perplexed. So I'm going to sketch that out. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with decision theory, but it's really simple. Don't let the formalism confuse you or intimidate you. Phi is just an action or belief or philosophical stance under consideration, right? O is possible outcomes of adopting that. Then the probability of O given phi is the probability that phi, adopting realism, whatever it may be, has certain outcomes. And we can conjoin various outcomes. Doesn't have to just be one, we can deal with many. I'll show how that works. And then this is the utility of that outcome. It's some sort of quantitative assignment of the benefit of pursuit of adopting that outcome. So if we set all of those, this is our expected utility function for adopting phi, whether that's scientific realism, anti-realism, constructivism, whichever view it is. We have to add a few things in, though, right? We have to make sure that that's agent relative. We have to also make sure that it accounts for the context, the practical context under consideration, right? You aren't going to be, your potential outcomes are going to have different utilities, whether you are a working scientist or a science educator. And so our utilities need to all be indexed to the context, of course. Then M, sorry. I have G in here, but I have M over there. G or M is the motivation, right? What motivates you? What are you trying to achieve? So if you do this for two opposing views, right? We do this for phi and psi. We can say that an agent prudentially ought to adopt phi over psi when that inequality holds. Make sense? Everybody sort of with me? Yeah. Couple rounding heads, sorry. So the benefit of working within this decision theoretic framework for this, first of all, it's a well-established method of application. It's enterprise grade, as they say. It's pre-built tools. So we have a lot of expertise and work to draw from that we could extend into this domain. And it isolates discussions of potential outcomes from their conditionalized probabilities and their conditionalized probabilities from discussions of the benefits of those outcomes, right? So if we go back to here, we're able to talk about the likelihood of an outcome, right? If you're a realist, what's the likelihood that you're going to make good methodological advancement? That's a separate question from what the benefits of having good metrological outcomes. Likewise, we can also say, what's the probability that you'll be thoroughly embarrassed when your metaphysics is overturned, right? When your ontology is disproved. And what's the expected negative utility? We can therefore have these very explicit conversations about not just the probabilities, but also the utilities. And they can divide out depending by which outcome we're discussing. And so the last point, which I really like, is that it makes this explicit, right? We can sit down, we can have a conversation. Do you really think that the cost of being wrong about your ontology is only -2? Like, no, it's got to be -20. We can sort of grade all these things against, and it at least provides a, what yesterday we saw, whose talk was that? The meta language gives us a framework in which we can have these conversations. So here's some examples, right? Just so you flush this out a little bit, you get what I'm talking about. Imagine Dr. Sato, she's a mid-career theoretical physicist. She works in this highly theoretical subfield with, unclear competitive empirical constraints, right? She's like string theory maybe, or what have you. But there's all these grant funding pressures and a community that, values conciliation, values the unification of theories. So her goals she sets for herself, she says, okay, I want to advance scientific progress. Understood as this deep explanatory integration, right? She wants explanations. Counts progress. And she wants to maintain her own internal motivational coherence. She doesn't want to sort of burn herself out. She wants to, think that she can do it the whole time. And if she, stumbles a little bit, she doesn't want her whole motivation to fall apart. She also wants to just, avoid long-term embarrassment due to metaphysical overreach, right? She doesn't want to say some experiment shows up, proves that strings are wrong, and she's built her whole career on that, and suddenly she's the pariah in the department. So she's debating, in the context of her research, whether to be a realist or some sort of instrumentalist. Well, she can then go on to define various outcomes, right? These are her goals, her motivations. Outcome one, realism actually yields this greater heuristic fertility and allows her to do much more ambitious model. So that's one outcome that she thinks realism might provide to her, right? She suspects that. She also thinks that she worries, though, right, that realism might tend to, the outcome might be that she's proven wrong. If she's a realist, if she's too committed to this, she's going to feel embarrassed. She's, not going to feel good about herself, whatever it may be. But another positive outcome might be that realism leads to better long-term theory integration. That there's actually this, disciplinary progressive outcome. Then she starts considering instrumentalism and what the potential outcomes of adopting that are. One is that it avoids all this metaphysical risk, right? Wouldn't that be great? But still is able to yield progress. So she sort of is able to do away with this one. Or it might just completely undermine her motivational drive and theoretical vision. She gets nothing from. That's the risk. So here we have all those outcomes, and she just starts assigning probabilities, right? Thinks, well, if I adopt realism, right? Realism being phi, I think it's about a 50% chance that it's going to yield this greater heuristic fertility, and also the let me go wrong too. You switch. You can see basically how this works, right? And then all you do to actually calculate the expected utility of adopting realism, multiply the probability by the expected utility, add it all up, and there's your expected utility for her in that context, given her motivations of adopting realism. Likewise, she runs the same calculation for instrumentalism, given her two concerns about instrumentalism, assigns probabilities, assigns expected utilities, gets a result, and compares them. And based on these considerations, Dr. Sato finds she has a prudential reason to adopt a scientific realist attitude in her professional context. What's important about this, right? You're going to look at the assignments of probabilities and utilities and say, like, but that's just so arbitrary. What I'm concerned about is providing a framework in which we can continue to have dialogue, where an anti-realist can come in and see her sort of lay that out and say, oh, that's ridiculous. No, the negative utility from having things overturned should be way higher. It shouldn't be 30, it should be 300. Relative to the way that you've weighted these other. So it at least provides us a way to be explicit about our practical, pragmatic considerations when we're adopting different philosophical elements. One more example, just so that we, sort of see how this would work in another context. Dr. Oneki is a early career climate modeler. She works in this politically sensitive domain, right, where policy impact, public trust, and model robustness are sort of like the paramount desiderata. Her funding, her institutional evaluation, and public communication all depend on this predictive accuracy and credibility. She could literally ruin the planet if she gets this wrong, makes too large of a commitment to something, and then, the political opponents pounce on that and use it to, open new coal mines. So she wants to maximize her model reliability and actionable predictions, but avoid politicization or controversy over metaphysical claims. And so she wants to sort of preserve the professional reputation of the discipline and make sure that her institute is portrayed as neutral, right? We're just doing pure science here. We're not political. Whether that's possible or not, that's the image that she wants to maintain. So again, she lists her outcomes. Don't need to go through them all in detail. I think everybody sort of gets the idea. Assigns her probability, and maybe she's sitting there with one of her colleagues and they're debating how to frame one of their press releases. They say, well, should we sort of put in this realist framework, or should we be more instrumentalist about it? And they debate these probabilities, and they debate these utility assignments. They do the same thing for instrumentalism. When they compare them, they say, oh, good thing we did that. Now we know that we have a prudential reason to adopt a realist factor. Nice little chart, right? You can see how these things compare. You could even think in terms of a multitude of options, right? It doesn't just have to be these two, this or that. Maybe we have 10 different stances that we're considering at one time. And maybe we even want to add all of these together so that I have one overarching, maybe I'm operating in several contexts. And I don't want to switch between it. I hate this sort of back and forth mind. I'm not a fence sitter. I want to be on one side of the fence and be happy where I am. So maybe you run the numbers for all of your practical contexts. And add them together, and whichever bar is higher, go with that. Now, one of the other great benefits of a pragmatic approach, I think, again, is that we have common grounds for the way that we might debate those probabilities and utility, right? If we look at the history of science, for instance, and we see that realists are overwhelmingly more productive, more generative of scientific progress in some specific context of scientific practice, and we find ourselves in that context and we value scientific progress, we have an empirical reason to set a probability there, a high probability that being a realist is actually going to achieve the outcome. But there's other, I sort of went whole hog on that historical way of assigning probabilities. But I think there's a lot of other perfectly acceptable across, no matter whether you're a realist, anti-realist, whatever, empirical methods for helping to inform those probabilities assignments. We can run randomized controlled trials. We can do X5. There's all kinds of ways that we might point to a probability and say, haven't you seen that new study from the XY camp that shows every working scientist with any funding at all is a realist, and instrumentalists never get any money at all? And one of your goals is to get money, isn't it? So you should assign probability 0.99 there. The other one that I sort of hinted at in my prior work is this sort of existential approach, looking at people with certain philosophical outlooks and judging their character, right? It might turn out that you've discovered that anti-realists are just all jerks, right? And I think that's a sufficient reason to not be an anti-realist. I'm not saying.
Thank you very much.
No, I also am sometimes an anti-realist, but I don't think it makes you a jerk. But I think there is this question of who you want to be behind all of this, right? What kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be the one that gets the funding? Do you want to be the one that's nice to your neighbors? Whatever it may be. If you notice a trend that seems to track with philosophical attitudes, right? Like, maybe you don't want to be a nihilist because not because nihilism is wrong, but just because you hate listening to nihilists, right? You imagine other people probably feel the same. You want people to like you, whatever it may be. So what I'm sort of proposing here is that we combine the normative logic of decision theory with this existential pragmatic framework of James and Rorty that Van Frossen suggested might be applied to the philosophical stance adoption problem. And using prudential utility as the evaluative standard while investigating the relative outcome probabilities using empirical methods, because empirical methods serve as common ground, right? We get this framework that allows us to have these conversations and allows us to have those conversations using common ground still, evidence. So I think it's important to mention here, before I sort of laid this out in a decision theoretical framework, Arthur Fine responded to my outline of the pragmatic existential approach to the Scientific Realism Debate and said, you know, sure, go ahead, try and find pragmatic reasons if you want, but it's never going to matter, because no matter what sort of in the context of scientific practice, for instance, no matter what philosophical attitude you have, you can always find a pragmatic justification to do any kind of scientific practice. It may be a little more cobbled together, a little more ad hoc, but there's always a reason just to say, well, I know that's productive. I know it's productive to do metrology this way. I know it's productive to do that this way. But the mode of argument that he has is very abstract. It's very a priori. This is an a posteriori, right? Where we're looking not at whether it's possible to be a realist and do, or an anti-realist and do good work in some way, achieve some sort of outcome. Looking at the probabilities, right? And here, what do realists actually tend towards in this context, or anti-realists tend towards in this context? And I think focusing on those empirical details in whatever way you choose is a really promising way forward for helping provide a guide to the perplexed. So in conclusion, right, what I'm arguing is that this focus on pragmatic risks and prudential reasons rather than epistemic risks and rationality, which has been the traditional terms of the debate, in the scientific realism debate provides us with a wide range of ways to engage in fruitful dialogue with our opponents and watchers, and even with ourselves in our private lives. A decision theoretic expected utility framework provides clarity to those discussions. Shouldn't be reified in any way. I don't think that there is an objective probability that this outcome will come or blah, blah, blah. So it's a way for us to talk. It's a common language. But it allows us to separate out questions of the expected likelihood of outcomes of stance adoption from the expected utility of achieving those. Allows us to debate all that stuff and the weights that we assign to them very directly and explicitly. So this method works with common ground held by all parties to the debate. Helps them engage in this productive dialogue and potentially provide some edifying analysis that can guide their philosophical commitment making. And really, when we think of, when we say things like the realism debate has reached a stalemate, in one of Anjon's papers, he says, the real concern here is like, where's the edifying information? Where's the reason guiding, or the choice guiding stuff once we start being voluntarists, right? It seems like now it's just all up for grabs. How do we even make these decisions other than just like, I kind of want to be a realist today. I kind of want to blow. And then just to also make some reference to some prior work, right? This method can be collaborative or adversarial, right? I don't think it's necessarily, you shouldn't be a realist. It's, hey man, can we figure out what we should be doing here? Let's all get to some common ground. Let's all get to a common choice about how we're going to write that press release together. And it does provide what Bobby was talking about, I think, this common language or a meta language in which these conversations can be had between these various parties, through which we can uncover what I would like to call, sort of in line with some comments like Kyle, prudential wisdom, rather than, assertive, definitive facts of you have to be a realist. Just gives us a little bit of, actually, it turns out I didn't realize this, but being a realist is probably going to help. It'd be wise to be a realist, but not by any means necessary. It's not pragmatic requirements, prudential wisdom. There we go. That's it.